Hello and welcome to Jason's Macintosh Museum. I'm Jason, your host, and today we're looking at a Macintosh PowerBook 170 from 1991. Looking at the Macintosh PowerBook 170, you could really say that the 170 was Apple's first no compromises laptop computer, because even though Apple had released the Macintosh Portable a couple of years earlier, the Macintosh Portable did have some issues, mainly with its size and its weight. It was a very large computer and it weighed far more than your average laptop did. And so even though it had a decent amount of power and had very good expandability and excellent battery life, it wasn't really a proper laptop in that sense. That's actually why it was called the Macintosh Portable. But the Macintosh PowerBook series of laptops were proper laptops in every sense of the word. They were small, they were light, they had very good battery life, and they had very good performance. And when the PowerBook range was first launched in late 1991, the 170 was the top of the line. And basically what you got with the 170 was you got the computing power of a Macintosh 2 CI in a laptop configuration. Now, the 170 was one of three models that were launched in October of 1991 as the new PowerBook, as part of the new PowerBook line. The base model, the low-end version, was the PowerBook 100, which I've already done a video on, so have a look for that. The mid-range model was the PowerBook 140, and the top of the line was this, the PowerBook 170. And the PowerBook 100, if you've looked at that, does look a bit different to the 170. And that's mainly because the 100 had its own unique case and internal design, because the 100 was actually built for Apple by Sony. It was more or less a Macintosh Portable that they had shrunk and put into a laptop case. But the 140 and 170 were Apple's own design. Apple designed them and Apple built them. And as a result, there are a few differences. So, with the 170, it wasn't just all about power. You also got an excellent display, because the 170 used an active matrix LCD, just like the Macintosh Portable, but on the 170 it was backlit as standard. And even though it was only a monochrome display, it was very clear and very bright and very sharp. And so it really did offer one of the best displays available on any laptop that you could buy. And just like the PowerBook 100 and 140, you got the centrally positioned trackball, which made it very easy to use with a graphical user interface. You got an excellent quality keyboard, a good battery. The 170 used a NiCad battery, which gave you good battery life. Not as good as the lead-acid battery in the Portable, of course, but this, of course, weighs a lot less. And built-in floppy drive. And you also got all of the normal expansion ports that you would normally have on a desktop Macintosh. Although, strangely enough, the 170 and 140 did not include a video output port when they were released, which was a little unusual because the Macintosh Portable did have one. However, the second generation of PowerBooks that were launched a year later in 1992, the I think it was the 145, the 160 and the 180, did have monitor output ports, but you got everything else. You got external SCSI, you got serial ports, audio in and out. You got everything basically. So it was really the first Apple laptop that could be used both as a desktop replacement, but also as a proper portable laptop. So the specifications on the Macintosh PowerBook 170. It was launched in October of 1991 and was discontinued in October of 1992 when it was replaced by the Macintosh PowerBook 180 as Apple's top-of-the-line PowerBook. It has a 25 MHz Motorola 68030 CPU, along with a 25 MHz Motorola 68882 numeric coprocessor. So you basically got the same performance as a standard Macintosh 2 CI. It had 4 MB of memory as standard, expandable up to 8 MB. It came with either a 40 or 80 MB hard disk, and of course it had a built-in floppy drive. The display, which was only used on the 170 at the time, was a 640 by 400 pixel 2-bit, in other words, 1-bit, as in black and white, active matrix LCD. So even though it wasn't a grayscale display, it was a very, very clear, bright and sharp. The battery was a NiCad battery, which was used by all the PowerBooks at the time, with the exception of the 100, that still used a lead-acid battery. And battery life, I think, was probably around 3 hours, I would say, on a full charge, if your battery was working properly. But nowadays, very few of these batteries are working properly, as I'll explain later. Other than that, you got the full complement of I/O ports as well, and that's about it. So I think it's enough talking about the Macintosh PowerBook 170. Let's have a closer look at it. Here is the front view of the Macintosh PowerBook 170, and as you can see, it has the very similar look to the PowerBook 140. In fact, it has an identical case to the 140, but it even looks very similar to the 100. In fact, I think I have a 100 down here that I can use to demonstrate the similarities. So if I move that over, here's a PowerBook 100. If I can get this open. So you can see that the styling is similar, but the 100 is physically a bit smaller and has a smaller screen. But now back to the 170. So the 170, when the lid is closed, it's certainly not as thin as the PowerBook 100, but it's certainly much, much smaller and lighter than the Macintosh Portable. So just open it up again. So starting from the top, we have the screen latch, which you slide to the left, slide to the right to open the screen. Here's the screen itself. This is the, focus. This is the active matrix 640 by 400 pixel display. Here we have the Macintosh PowerBook 170 name tag and Apple logo. And down here we have the built-in speaker. And below that we have the built-in keyboard, which, just like other PowerBooks, is a very good quality keyboard for a laptop. And then down here we have the centrally positioned trackball. And the idea behind that was to allow you to type with both hands on the keyboard, resting one palm here and one palm here, so that you could type easily and get access to the trackball when you needed it. So that's the front view. If we turn it around and look at the side, you can see that on the side we have the battery compartment here for the built-in NiCad battery. And then over here we have one of the 2 feet that you can swivel to raise the rear end of the PowerBook to tilt it to a more comfortable angle. So you can see that you simply rotate the wheel, and that's in the down position, and then you rotate like that to bring it up. So that's the side. Now on the back, you'll notice that the only port that's uncovered is in fact this connector here, which is for the AC adapter. The rest of the ports are hidden behind this door. And I should mention that on PowerBook 100s, on 100 series PowerBooks, these doors can break very easily. So if you have one that has the original door, be very careful with it. To open, just pull from the top and the door opens up. And now we have all the built-in, all the ports. So if an internal modem was fitted, the telephone port would be there. This is the external SCSI port, And notice that it's not the standard Centronic style SCSI connector that most Macs have. On the PowerBooks, in order to save space, they used a high density or HDI SCSI port. So you need a special adapter in order to plug a standard Centronic SCSI device into this. We have one ADB port, audio out and input ports, printer and modem ports. Then we have the interrupt and reset switches, which you need to use a pin or some small a pen or something to press in on. And then we have the power button here. Now you'll notice that the ports do not appear to be labelled, apart from the telephone port. But as it turns out, it was a very clever piece of design on Apple's part. The logic was that if you were using your laptop, your PowerBook, and you wanted to plug something in, you would normally be standing in front of the PowerBook looking over the back to see what port was what. So in a brilliant piece of design, they thought, well, why don't we put the icons for each port on the top of the case above the port rather than directly above the port facing the back. So if you look, let's see if I can get a shot of this. If I tilt, let me shut the lid. If I tilt this up, you can see these are the icons that tell you what each port is. So these are clearly visible when you're looking at the top of the laptop, as if you, which is how you would be looking at it if you were trying to plug something in. So that's quite clever. Now moving on to the other side, we have the built-in 1.4 megabyte SuperDrive. So that's the front view. Now I'll quickly tip it up and we'll look at the bottom, because that's where the information tag is. There we go. So here's the underside of the PowerBook 170. As you can see, this is where Apple put their information label. So this one is a PowerBook 170 made in USA. Although it turns out I have another PowerBook 170 which is identical, but it's actually made in Ireland. But this one happens to be made in the USA. And I think I'm right in saying that it wasn't long after this that Apple stopped making Macintosh computers in the USA, because I think by the early to mid 1990s they'd pretty much moved all of their production over to I think to Ireland and Singapore and Taiwan and some other places. So here we are, model number M5409, 7.5 volt power supply, 2 amps. There's the other information there. Okay, so that's the underside of the Macintosh PowerBook 170. So what we'll do now is we'll take it apart. Now, to take a Macintosh PowerBook 170 apart is the same procedure that you'd follow if you were taking apart any of the 100 series PowerBooks, with the exception of the 100 and the 190. In other words, this particular case was used by several different models. It was used by the 140, 145, 145B, 150, 160, 165, 170 and 180. So all of those used the same case. So the same procedure applies to all of them. Now the first thing you have to do is to make sure you have the right type of screwdriver, because the PowerBook 100 series used Torx bits to hold them all together. So a Torx bit is a star bit that looks a bit like, the camera's going to focus on it, looks a bit like this. So the correct Torx bit in this case, I think, it's a T10 Torx. But thankfully, all the fasteners on this PowerBook are of the same size. So as long as you have a T10 Torx bit, you'll be fine. Now the first thing to do with any laptop is to take out the battery if it's fitted. Now to do that, we slide this cover backwards, or I should say forwards, in the direction of the arrow, and then you can pull the battery out from the case. So there's the battery. Now the next thing to do is to separate No, actually, no, it's not. You have to take the keyboard out next. So, we'll open it up. Now, to take the... No, we don't take the keyboard out. What am I saying? No, I'm getting confused. That's a different model of PowerBook. No, the next step is to separate the two halves of the bottom case. So the bottom case is this section, whoops, is this section here. And you can see that that's where they come apart. Now, to do that, we have to remove all the screws from the bottom case. But before we do that, very important thing. There is one screw we have to remove first, which lives just here. Now, this screw helps to hold the two halves of the bottom case together. But what happens is that if you remove the screws, the bottom screws here first, the case will start to separate and it puts enormous stress on this screw here. And what will happen is if this screw is still tight at the time, the plastic around it can crack and break, because I should mention, these PowerBooks are notorious for brittle case plastics, and I'll explain the problems that they have in a separate video. But basically what you need to remember is take this screw out first. So we'll do that. We'll do that now. And I think in fact this is not a T10. Oh, no, that one's actually a little bit smaller. That one appears to be a T8 Torx. So in fact you'll need a T8 Torx bit as well, just to take that one screw out. Yep, that's a T8. So I'll just take that out carefully. I should also stress, when you reassemble the PowerBook, do not over tighten these screws because you can crack the plastics. So now we're ready to take out the screws on the bottom of the case, but we also want to make sure that we leave this door open, because if we close the door, the port cover door, it actually helps to hold the two halves of the bottom case together. So again, if you take these screws out of the bottom and leave the door closed, the door will be preventing you from separating the case. You can actually break the door. So some people like to remove the door completely, but I don't, because to remove the door, you have to bend it enough to release the little plastic tabs from each side. And again, you can break the door by doing that. So I just leave the door open like this. So now we have the door open, we have this screw removed. We can now take out all of the screws out of the bottom case, and these are T10 Torx bits. So we take them all out. So now we have all the screws removed. You'll see that the case has started to separate, just like that. But you have to be careful. Don't try to force these apart just yet, because you'll see that the display cable is still connected to the logic board. And until you release that cable, you can't fully separate the two halves. So you have to get your finger in there and just carefully pop that cable loose, like that. Now the cable is loose, we can carefully separate the two halves. So here is the top half of the case, which, as you can see, includes the trackball, the display inverter board, and the backup battery, speaker, and connectors for the keyboard. So what we'll do is we'll probably take this apart next. So we'll just take the bottom case and put that aside for the moment. We'll come back to that. So this is the top section of the bottom case, and you can see the display is still connected or mounted to it. Zoom out a bit. So now, to strip this all down, we'll take the trackball out first. So again, take the T10 Torx driver and remove two screws, one here and one over here. Oh, actually, before you do, the data cable for the trackball is just here. We need to remove that carefully. So we'll just pop the locking tabs out carefully. We can now pull the cable out of the way. So now we'll take these two screws out. Oh, no, these are these must be T8 Torx bits. So, yeah, I thought they used T10s for all of them, but must use a mixture of T10s and T8s. So take these two out, and the trackball pulls out. So there's the trackball assembly removed from the system. And if you're wondering how to get the ball out of the trackball itself, you rotate this outer ring around the trackball, and you rotate it counterclockwise. And if you rotate it far enough, it will come out, and the ball simply falls out, just like that. It's actually very important to keep these rollers and these pads clean, because if your trackball is sticking, or it jumps around and doesn't work properly, it's probably just a question of dirt building up on the rollers. So I'll just put the trackball aside. Now we'll take out the keyboard. So the keyboard is attached to the top of the lower cover by these screws here, 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 and here. So we'll take those all out. But before we do, the keyboard data connector, the cable, there's two of them, one here, one here. We have to release those as well. So again, we'll just pop the locking clips on either side of the connector. Be very careful. I probably shouldn't be using a Torx for this. Actually, I'll use a I'll use a flathead screwdriver for this bit. There we go. Just pop those locking tabs. And now we can pull the two cables out. So you can see the cables are now loose. So now we can take the keyboard out. And as before, when reassembling, do not over-tighten these screws, because you will very likely damage the plastic casing. Now the keyboard can be lifted out. So there's the keyboard removed. And it's worth noting that all models, I believe, of the PowerBook 100 series, again apart from the 190 and the 100, all use the same keyboard, I believe. The PowerBook 150 may have used a slightly different type of keyboard, but certainly you can interchange these keyboards between the 140, 145, 145B, 160, 170 and 180 series. So put that aside. What we'll do now is we will remove the display inverter board here. This is a little piggyback board that drives the fluorescent backlight of the display. So there's two screws to remove, one here, one here. So we'll take those out, lift up on the board and it will disconnect, and then we have the actual connector for the fluorescent backlight. Just unplug that, and there's the inverter board out. Now, the inverter boards have to be matched with the type of display that you're using. Because, for example, the active matrix display used on the 170 and the 180 only have a brightness control. There's no contrast control, and that's why there is only one potentiometer on the inverter board. Displays that were used on the 140, 145, 145B and 160, which were passive matrix, had two potentiometers, one for brightness and one for contrast, so it's important not to get those mixed up. So what we can now do is we can now take out the display board, the interconnect board here, which houses the backup battery, the speaker, and the connector for the display, which is just here. So we have to unhook this connector, or unhook this cable. So we just slide the connector cover back and then carefully pull out, very carefully, pull out the ribbon cable, and it's now loose. Be very, very careful with these cables. These are very easy to tear, and once you tear them, there's repair them, so be careful. Right, we can now remove the interconnect board. There's a screw here and a screw over here. So let's take that out. And this should now just lift out. There we are. So there's the interconnect board removed. And again, the interconnect boards are also matched to the type of display that the PowerBook has. So there's the interconnect board out. And that's about it. Now, if you wanted to separate the display from the top of the upper half of the bottom case, you would have to carefully open this up. What you would need to do is to remove these two covers here and here, take out the screws behind them, and what you can then do is you can then remove the front bezel of the display, take that off, and then you can get to the other screws, one here and one here, that anchor the display to the hinges. Alternatively, what you can do is if you fold the display all the way back, so do this carefully so we don't damage the hinges. In fact, I think we have to close it for this. Be careful. If you pop these two covers off, one on each side, then you'll find that, in fact, let's try and do that carefully. Let's pop that cover and have a look. You have to be very careful when we do this. Oh, there we go, that cover's off. So you can see that behind the cover, there's one screw that actually mounts the display hinge to the bottom of the top half of the lower casing. So you take those two screws out, and then the whole display with its hinge assembly can be separated from this piece here. And we'll leave that there. I must admit, I don't want to disassemble this any further, mainly because of the plastics, because they are very, very brittle, as I'll explain in a later video, and by taking this apart and reassembling it, I could actually damage the plastics. So this will stay as it is, but there aren't any more components here to remove anyway. So what we'll do now is look at the bottom panel, which has all the other stuff in it. So what we have here is the lower section, and we have the hard disk here, floppy drive here, logic board here, and the memory expansion board sitting above it, and then the lower board underneath, and in this case we have a modem card here. So first of all, we'll take out the memory card, and we simply rock it back and forth to release it from its connector. And that's the memory expansion board that is now out of the system. Next thing we'll do is we'll take off the CPU card, this card here, which contains the CPU, FPU, built-in memory, and some other glue logic as well. And in fact, what this allowed Apple to do was use the same main board for both the PowerBook 140 and 170, and all they did was simply change this card to between the two models, so that the 140 I think had a 16 megahertz 030 with no FPU, the 170 has a 25 megahertz 030 with an FPU. So to remove the CPU card, 4 screws, and oh, flathead won't work, I need a Torx for that. Again, these look like T8s. Okay, now to separate the CPU card, the connector is on this side, so you have to very carefully pop it up. Oh, there we go, to free the connector, and the CPU card is now out of the system. Now, next, I think we'll take out the modem card. Now, whoever put in the modem card had actually used Phillips head screws here and here. Now, normally you'd be using Torx screws, but in this case they're Phillips heads, so I have to get a Phillips head bit, and we'll take these out. So there's two screws. Here's one, and there's the other. It's probably an old 2400 BPS modem. Completely useless. Well, it is now anyway. So there's the modem card out of the system. Now the next step is to release this upper bracket that holds the floppy drive and hard drive into place. But before we can do that, we have to remove the data cable for the hard disk. So to do that, we release the connector over here. Just lift up on the sides of the connector to release the ribbon cable. It's very important, don't try and pull on these ribbon cables until you release the connector, because you can apply enough force that you can in fact break or tear these ribbon cables. So you'll find that the cable is actually stuck with adhesive to this section of the bracket, so just carefully, I think we may have to leave it where it is. But what we can now do is release the cable from the hard disk itself, and Apple actually give you a little piece of plastic here which you can use to pull on it. So if you pull on this carefully, you'll see that, a better shot of that, you can see that if you pull carefully it will release the cable from the data cable from the hard disk. So now that is loose. So we can now remove the top bracket. To do that, there are two screws here. There's a screw here, and one down here. And there's also a clip that latches into this section here. So as you remove it, even though all the screws are out, you have to be careful to release that clip before the bracket will come out. So back to the Torx. And once again, be very careful with these screws. Do not over tighten them. Now, in fact, this one has already broken away. In fact, you can see here. I'm going to try and get a close up of this, but you can see that this screw here is actually broken away from its mounting here. You can see the threaded insert has actually broken away from the plastic. And this is in fact a very, very common problem on these PowerBooks. And the issue that you have is that if enough of these are broken, the PowerBook won't actually be able to stay in one piece. So we won't touch that, we don't have to. Remove this one. And remove this one. So we can lift the bracket up, but notice that it won't remove because it's hooked in here. So we have to push in to release the metal clip, which is a little tricky. Let's see if we can do this. Little tricky, it's very tricky. You can see in fact the clip in there that you have to release. So let me see if I can do that. Maybe get a shot of this on camera, but I've got a flathead for this. This is a little tricky, but certainly if I just pull on this, it will probably bend the bracket. So we don't want to do that. Oh, not quite. Close. Oh, I think it just released. Oh, I'm losing stuff now. This could take a minute. Okay, good. It's free. So there's the clip I was referring to there. So now the hard drive simply lifts out, and so does the floppy drive once you release the data cable, of course. So again, we'll just carefully lift up on the sides of the connector just to loosen them. There we go. Pull the cable out and the drive simply lifts out of the system. There we go. Now the next step is to take out the main board here. Now to do that, well, first of all, we have to remove these little spacers. There's 4 of them, here, 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 and here. Although that spacer is built into the battery connector, so that one doesn't have to be touched, but this one has to be removed, and that one already fell out when I tipped the case over, so let me retrieve that quickly. Okay, I've got them all, just put them aside. Okay, so what we do now is we have to remove this connector here, and I think this is actually a temperature sensor for the battery, which lives in this area here. So again, we'll just pop the connector locking tabs, and then we can carefully lift that ribbon cable out. There we go. Now, there are no screws that hold this board in, but there are 2 standoffs which are screwed in here and here, and they're meant to support the modem card if one is installed, but they also serve to keep the main board in place. As you can see, you can't yet remove it, so we have to either use some pliers or a small socket to take them out. Now I have to go and find some pliers because I don't think I have any, so I will be right back. Right, I now have a pair of pliers, so now I can take these 2 standoffs out. So I'll just carefully grab them and loosen them so I can then remove them by hand. That's one out, and here's the other one. Now, this one I have to be very careful with. Very close to the power plug, this one is. There we go. Okay, so now we can lift up and remove the main board. There it is. So at this point, let's take off the cover there. That's the bottom case. So that's how you take apart a PowerBook 170. So now we'll have a look at some of the components. Here is the main board out of the Macintosh PowerBook 170, and this board mainly contains the components that were common across different models, such as the SCSI controller, glue logic, connectors for the battery and keyboard and hard disk and so on. So starting from the top, we have all of the ports. We've got the power switch on the left. Focus. The reset interrupt switches, the serial, audio, ADB, SCSI ports, and the power connector there for the AC adapter. That's the connector there for the modem card if one is fitted. What else do we have? We've got some voltage regulators there. There's the connector for the floppy drive. Oh, and there's the... oh, focus. Focus. Camera doesn't want to focus. Let's see if I can fix that. So I'm actually zoomed in too far. There we go. You can see then the connector for the hard disk below. There's the serial number with the information. Motherboard Mac PowerBook 140/170. So this board is interchangeable between the 140 and 170. The only difference is the CPU daughter card, you could call it, that sits on top of it. Okay, now that I think is probably the serial port controller there. That's the SCSI controller there. What else? That's a connector for the battery, and in fact, notice a little bit of corrosion on the terminals there. Now, that's a consequence of leaving a battery inside a PowerBook for a very long period of time, which again I'll cover in the PowerBook problems video. But thankfully this one, still works. Connector there for the battery compartment temperature sensor. Not sure what that chip is for. No, not sure about that one. This, I believe, is the power manager chip, the chip that monitors the battery and probably handles the sleep and low power modes of the PowerBook. Connector on the left there, that's for the CPU daughter card. Some more chips there, not quite sure what they're for. These look like just regular glue logic chips, and that's about it. I should mention that this board is in fact double-sided, but there's really nothing much to talk about on the rear side of the board. Just a whole bunch of voltage regulators and other small ICs. So that's the main board or motherboard out of the PowerBook 170. So now let's have a look at the CPU card. Whoops. There we go. So here is the CPU card out of the PowerBook 170. So starting from the top, we have the main CPU, the Motorola 6803 running at 25 megahertz. And then we have the ROM chips over here. Some more glue logic chips there. Then we've got Apple Computer Incorporated, copyright 1991. Could be even more. In fact, yeah, I don't know. I think they're the ROM chips. I'm not sure what they are. Actually, could even be. It's probably the video memory. Probably that's the video memory. So I'd say one of these two is probably the video controller. Not sure which one. That's not sure what that is. Well, there's the connector for the memory expansion card, and that's sorry, no, that's for the display. That's the display connector, and that's the memory expansion card connector. And we can see down there, upside down, Macintosh PowerBook 140/170. Although this particular card was used only in the 170 because it had the faster CPU. So that's about it for that side of the board, but we'll quickly flip it over and we'll show you the other side. And we'll tip it like that. There we go. So here's the back side of the CPU card. Must be more display memory there. What else do we have? There's the FPU, the Motorola 68882 running at 25 megahertz. There's the serial number of the board. And there's the connector that mates with the motherboard. Okay, so that's the CPU card. So now we'll have a look at the hard disk, which is right over here. There we go. So this is the original hard disk that came with the PowerBook 170. So it's an 80 megabyte unit. And this one is an IBM WDS 280. So this, of course, is a 2.5-inch SCSI hard disk, because Apple didn't start using IDE disks in their PowerBooks until the PowerBook 150, I think the 190 and the 5300 series came out. So admittedly, if you have one of these older PowerBooks that uses SCSI drives, these drives can be a little bit hard to hard to come across. Certainly ones that are in working condition as well. So that's the front of the disc. On the back, we've got the oops, this is a label cover on that, so you can see we've got the controller ICs there and the connector there, which has both data and power on it. Okay, right, so that's the hard disk. Now, the floppy drive. So the floppy drive looks, well, it's not much to really see there, but this is the standard floppy drive used in all of the PowerBook 100 series, again excluding the 100 and the 190. And as you can see on the bottom there, it's actually a Sony. It's a Sony, what is it? Looks like a MPF 22A. So it's basically a low profile 1.4 megabyte Apple SuperDrive, but it still has auto eject. You can see the eject motor just here, and that's about it really. What we'll do is we'll have a quick look at the battery as well. Where's the battery? Battery, here we go. So this is the standard nickel cadmium battery that was used in these PowerBooks. Macintosh PowerBook rechargeable battery. This one's assembled in Mexico, but I've seen them assembled in Japan as well. And so it's a NiCad. All of these batteries were NiCad batteries. But strange enough, it doesn't actually specify the battery's nominal voltage. But I believe on these batteries it's about 7.5 volts. And I'm not sure what the capacity was either. It doesn't actually say that either. So the battery terminals are on the edge here. And some more stuff on the back there. What does that say? Warning, yes, 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 don't short the battery out. Yes, 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 I know all that. Blah, blah, blah. Not much to really talk about there. So, so that's the battery. And notice it comes with the cover built into it, the sliding cover, that actually locks into the PowerBook's case to secure the battery in place. And let's also have a quick look at the memory expansion card. This one's an aftermarket memory expansion card made by a company called PSI. So you can see copyright 1992. So this card takes the PowerBook's memory from 2 megabytes to 4 megabytes, but you can expand up to 8 megabytes with an appropriate adapter card. And finally, the modem card, which again is of course an aftermarket card. Again, it looks like it's from a company called PSI. So the main controller down there, it's probably a Rockwell chipset, most likely. Complies with yada yada yada. That'd be the ROM there. Austel permit, 1993. So I'd say this would be your standard 2400 BPS modem by the looks of it. Not that will do you any good these days, of course. And yep, that's a Rockwell chipset. There's there's one of the controllers there. Oop, focus. Connector there, and some other miscellaneous bits and pieces. Okay, so that is the full tour of the Macintosh PowerBook 170 from 1991. And so in the next part of the video series, once the PowerBook's been reassembled, we'll start it up and show a couple of old Macintosh games, as always. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for part 2.